Welcome to How Happiness Thinks, our 6-week journey investing in our happiness. And today is possibly the most difficult lesson of all, lesson 5, when joy seems elusive. And the reason it's one of the most difficult is because we are going to try and appreciate Judaism's perspective for coping with the pain of loss. And before we start today's lesson, I do want to make a couple of introductions or disclaimers, etc. It's probably one of the greatest challenges to our happiness throughout our lives, when we lose a loved one or we experience some sort of great loss. And as a result, I'm going to do my best to be sensitive. But if you or someone who's watching this recording feels that somehow something I say is maybe a little bit offensive, or maybe at some point in the future, someone will be watching this recording and they will have just recently experienced the loss, and perhaps I'm not talking sensitively enough, despite my best efforts, to talk to someone that has just recently lost a loved one, then I'll ask for your forgiveness in advance. That's first of all. Second of all, I want to say as follows. When dealing with loss, we're going to tie, and I say this especially at the current state right now, we're going to easily be able to be distracted by a separate topic, which is why does a God that we believe is good do bad things? I'm talking specifically because we find ourselves currently in the wake of October 7th. Still within a year, although approaching the first anniversary. And of course, there's the Holocaust, and there's these big questions like that, which, especially when you talk about them from a Jewish perspective, from a religious perspective, where you believe in God, those become very difficult questions. We are not going to skirt those issues, although we will not address them head on. And I will make some recommendations for some further reading and some further studying if you would like to explore those topics a little bit more in depth. One more thing. I'm going to do my best, even though we're definitely going to use the words loss of a loved one throughout today's lesson. I'm going to do my best to talk at least a little bit more general than that, so that we can apply these same concepts even if we're not currently experiencing the loss of a loved one, but we are experiencing some other great loss, which may be challenging to our happiness in the same way. So, for example, a tremendous financial loss I can see as being something, maybe similar is the wrong word, but something that also can be as big of a challenge to our happiness, and to which these same principles can be applied. But very often I will be talking in the words of, losing a loved one physically, and a loved one dying, and that's on a variety of levels. Sometimes that's at an old age when it's not, there's nothing tragic about it, it's just sad. And sometimes it's at a very young age, or perhaps battling an illness, or perhaps even at an older age but battling an illness for a few years that somehow seems a lot more tragic. But we're going to try and kind of stay general enough that it should apply to most of these situations. Before we start with the Jewish approach, I think it's probably a good idea to take a look at some of the commonly reported human responses to traumatic loss. And then we can kind of contrast them versus the Jewish approach, and read some texts and see what we can glean in terms of contrasting those two. So probably the most commonly cited psychological model for dealing with loss, and if you've dealt with the loss of a loved one, and you've maybe consulted with someone or even just spoken out with a friend, there's a good chance that they reference this, comes from a psychiatrist, an American psychiatrist named Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. It's in your book on page 154. And she has a book called On Death and Dying, which she first introduced in 1969. And the model has gained very, very widespread acceptance for being the model in the academic world for how human beings deal with death and with loss and with grief. It's become a staple in every course that's taught in colleges or seminaries, etc., on the topic. Welcome, Ron. And They originate from her research with the terminally ill patients. And she describes the emotional stages from observing them, or from observing them and interviewing them, et cetera, that people go through as they learn they're going to die. And these are kind of 5 stages that she's kind of put it down into. Now, back to my original kind of not disclaimer, but my introductory remarks where I said this can be applied to other things. She herself, with time, began to apply this not just to terminally ill patients, but also, for example, to children that were struggling with their parents' divorce, to the end of a relationship, particularly a very long relationship and a very deep relationship. And for today's conversation, we're going to look at it again through the paradigm of the death of a loved one. So the 5 stages will appear here on your screen, or you could follow along with me again on page 154. And they go as follows. Denial. Denial essentially works as follows. The emotions and the feelings and the experience of losing a loved one is such a big one to feel that often what people do is they kind of turn on some form of denial. Whether that denial looks like throwing themselves into work, whether that denial looks like just totally not being aware, and not fully comprehending and not fully recognizing the extent, the applications of the fact that they lost a loved one. So that is usually stage number 1. And by the way, even though we're going through them in some sort of order, they can occur, and this is again from a lot of scientific observation, they can occur in whatever, grief is not the same for anyone. So it can occur in varying degrees, and sometimes go from denial to anger and back to denial, et cetera, et cetera. These are just typical coping mechanisms that people go through. So number 2 would be anger. This is where a person is outraged. Why me? Why does this happen to me? And that might or may not lead to number 3, which is bargaining. Bargaining is where there's some sort of higher power, or even with themselves, and people are trying to kind of hoping that they can roll back time and undo the grief. Depression is stage 4, and that's where they actually take that big emotion and they make it bigger than it actually is. So I lost my dad. My life is going to end. I'll never be able to get back to normal. And there's no point going on. Why even get up in the morning, etc., as we know, depression. So this person kind of withdraws to being very, very paralyzed and lonely and refuses to seek help, etc. So that's depression. And number 5 is acceptance. Usually that's why they listed as number 5, because usually it's the last one. Acceptance being where we come to term with the tragedy, and now there's a new reality where I can gain some sort of equilibrium emotionally to be able to move on with my life. And again, not everyone experiences all 5 of these stages. They're certainly not all experienced in a linear fashion. But on the whole, these are the common emotional responses. I think the goal from a standpoint of emotional well-being is to reach the stage of acceptance. So if you want to give it some sort of linear order, it would end with acceptance, because that's kind of the goal, to reach some sort of equilibrium where we can move on. But I want to try and do a little exercise, okay? So on page 155, we're going to be exploring 3 of these. Let me explain to you why we're going to take out from our conversation for today, we're going to take out the 2 stages of bargaining and acceptance. The reason is acceptance, I think most of us can agree, is a good emotion to feel. It's a good place to be, and maybe not too quickly, but at some point, the person should reach a stage of acceptance, and I don't think we're going to have that much disagreement about that. Bargaining, I think, is a little bit more complicated to have a conversation about. It's least relevant to our conversation because it's obviously much more applicable when a person themselves are dying or have a terminally ill, terminal illness, etc. It's not as much applicable to someone who's dealing with the loss of a loved one. So I want to talk about the other 3, okay? What I'd like to ask you is, when it comes to denial, anger, and depression, right? With all 3 of these, my question for you is as follows. Do you believe that this emotion or this stage is A, necessary, and B, avoidable? I'm trying to think if I should add a C, which is beneficial, but I guess Do we feel it's necessary and beneficial is one question. And do we feel that it's avoidable? Um, what do you think? And I guess it can be anywhere along that spectrum. So it can be necessary and avoidable. So you're gonna put in an effort to make it happen. It can be unnecessary but unavoidable. Does that make sense? What I'm asking? Like you might be able to say the denial. Yeah, you're right. It's an unnecessary emotion. You don't need to feel it, and maybe you don't gain anything out of it, but it's unavoidable. Human beings are just like that. And I'd love to hear some input from you guys. What do you think about these three stages? Again, denial, anger, and depression. Let me start with Elise. Elise, if I can ask you to start with denial, okay? Is denial beneficial or not? And can denial be avoided or overcome?
I, well, it's probably beneficial because the shock of someone dying is overwhelming, and there's a lot of practical things you have to do to plan a funeral, etc. And from experience, I felt kind of numb when people died in my life, but I was sort of felt like, oh, it didn't really happen. I was just in denial, and I kept functioning, putting things together for funerals, etc. It doesn't
So you
hit you
think that
till
that was
later.
helpful to you? Being in
I think
denial
it
was a
has to do
helpful
with,
state,
I'm sorry,
right?
what?
So you feel that being in denial was helpful for you. It was a helpful
I think it
stage.
was helpful because there are things we have to do to bury a
Yeah.
person, and etc. Yeah.
Okay. Um, and do you think that it's avoidable? Do you think if you would have
Uh,
chosen not to enter a stage of
I
denial,
think
you
it's,
could have?
I really
Or you think
think
it's just something that happens to
something natural that happens because we would be overwhelmed with shock. And I think it'd be too
okay?
much maybe sometimes for our system. So somehow your body knows to just give it to have the feelings come back
Okay.
a little later.
Ron, Ron, what do you think about anger? Is anger beneficial?
Um, Only to channel the emotions that you haven't come to grips with. Um, you have to. Um, the people that I've known that have gone through this, that have experienced extreme anger, have either not been able to express the or cope with the denial and the depression.
Okay. And do you think it's avoidable? Do you think anger is avoidable?
It Yes,
Okay. With some work, obviously. Um,
absolutely.
Phil, what do you think about depression? Beneficial, necessary, or not?
Well, first of all, I mean, my view on this is the emotion that the person has to experience. So I think it's all beneficial if it leads to acceptance, at some point, if it leads to acceptance. And
If it's a
as you
stepping
said,
stone towards acceptance, then you're okay with that.
yeah, and I don't think that, I think there is a certain element, it's normal to be depressed when my mom died, my dad died. I mean, to me, and I don't want to talk to anybody. I don't want to do anything. I just want to drink tea, sit on my bed and drink tea and,
Right.
whatever. So I think whatever would help me get through all the stages. And as you said, they don't come, uh, grief comes in waves and there's no order to it. So I think it's all just part of the process.
Right. Um, I think you bring up a very, very good point. And it's probably another introduction that I should have made at the beginning of today's lesson. Let me start off by making a disclaimer that nothing I'm saying today is an intention of judging anyone. So just because we're having a conversation about whether depression is beneficial or not, the conversation is not therefore anybody who's depressed should be judged as being terrible, etc. No, I think that when we experience emotions, we experience them as a result of who we are up until that day, which is why, for example, I don't know if there's anyone on this group that's like this, but I've spoken to people like this who lost, let's say, a mom and a dad, but maybe they were 10 or 15 years apart. Their reactions to the two of them were different. And not just because, they kind of had experience with loss. It was also because they were a different person 10 to 15 years later. As we know, you study more, you have more experience, etc. Maybe, your mom passed away when you were in your 30s and your dad passed away when you were in your 50s. That you're a very different person in your 30s and in your 50s. Maybe I should have chosen teenage years and 40s. Maybe that's even more of a stark contrast, etc. So our emotions, I guess, while simultaneously I'm saying you can't really judge someone for them, because they are who they are. There's no time in the middle. Like I would never, ever, even as a rabbi and someone who often teaches about these types of subjects, about happiness and about loss and about grief, etc. I would never choose to be teaching a subject like this to someone who just lost a loved one. Does that make sense? Like I would never say, "Oh, you just lost a loved one. Let me tell you how to grieve." You can't change a person. But while I'm simultaneously saying you can't, that time you can't change, and you cannot, and a particular person cannot judge them because they are who they are and they're going through it however they're going through it. I do believe that over life we do have a choice that way. In other words, I think I know most of you well enough to know that none of you, at least the people that are live on the Zoom, to know that none of you are experiencing loss right now. But perhaps in 20 years from now you will be. And the fact that you might choose to have a different perspective based on Judaism, based on today's class, might change the way you will have those feelings coming at you because of the way you look at life. And again, this is all based on our fundamental foundation stone for this whole course. Yeah, it's in the title, How Happiness Thinks. Our emotions follow our intellect. So if there's information we haven't been exposed to, or if there are topics that we've never thought about, and then we're caught by surprise, and then emotions just start coming to us, 100%, those are emotions, they are what they are. But our emotions are always a product of who we are in our minds. And that's, I guess, the conversation we're having here. Does that add some perspective, Phil, to why I'm asking you this question?
Yes.
Okay. So having said that, and not judging anyone, depression, do you think that that's a beneficial, and again, before we get to whether you can choose it or not, assuming that you could choose it, do you think it's a beneficial and necessary emotion? And I guess you could say, if you feel it's a step towards acceptance, then you would say it isn't a beneficial and necessary emotion. But if you feel you can get to acceptance without it, then that's probably better, right?
Yeah, and I think it's also a question of, the extent. I mean, you can feel depressed for 20 minutes, as long as is it not debilitating, is if you allow if I allow myself to feel the feelings, but to move past them, then I think it can be, to recognize it and be able to move past it is important too. So I'm not saying I'm never going to, not be depressed, but I can choose to limit the extent of it, I guess.
That's such a good point. It's such a beautiful point you brought up. If it's debilitating or not. I don't know if this is the actual difference in definition, but let's go with it just in case. I would say maybe that's the difference between sadness and depression. That depression is when it becomes debilitating and you're no longer functioning because this grief is overwhelming you. Whereas sadness is kind of your feeling of the feeling. Anyways, more on this a little later. Let me just finish it off with you, Phil. Do you believe that depression is avoidable? Do you think that a person has a choice whether they become depressed or not? Over this topic, not life in general, just.
Yes, I do, because you made the distinction, I think, between, I was thinking maybe more sadness than depression. Right. So
yeah. You think that a person has control to one degree or another, obviously, to choose sadness or depression?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I think this conversation is going to be very, very helpful for us. As we have seen, a significant component of the distress that is experienced when a person loses a loved one is the feeling of outrage over the injustice of death. It feels like it's wrong, right? That's why they're angry. That's why they're depressed. That's why they go into denial. A lot of it is the injustice. It doesn't feel like it's the right thing. And that's why what I'd like to do next is enter a discussion where we're going to examine two texts that are a description of two famous Jews grappling with loss. And they are Job and Beruria. Okay, if you haven't heard of Beruria, Beruria was the wife of Rabbi Meir, who was one of the greatest Talmudic sages or Mishnaic sages that's brought down in the Mishnah. Let's start with her story. That is text 1. Mark, if I can ask you to read for us, please. Page 157.
Okay. 157. Okay. It happened that one Shabbat afternoon, while Rabbi Meir was lecturing at the study hall, his two sons died. What did their mother, Beruia, do? She laid them on the bed and covered them with a sheet. After Shabbat, Rabbi Meyer arrived from the study hall and said to her, "Where are my two sons?" Said she to him, "They went to the study hall." Said he to her, "But I looked in the study hall. I did not see them." She handed him a cup of wine for Havdalah. After reciting Havdalah, he again asked, "Where are my two sons?" She said to him, "They went to a particular place and will soon return." She served him dinner. After he recited the grace after meals, she said, "My teacher, I have a question to ask." Said he to her, "Ask." She said to him, "Before today, someone left an item with me for safekeeping, and he has now come to collect it. Shall we return the item or not?" Said he to her, "My daughter, is not a custodian required to return the deposit to its master?" Said she to him, "My teacher, if not for your words, I could not have brought myself to return it." What did she do next? She grasped his hand, led him up to that room, brought him near the bed, and removed the sheet from over them, and he saw the two of them lying dead upon the bed. He began to weep, saying, my children, my teachers, meaning my children in the natural sense, and my teachers who enlightened me, my eyes, with words of Torah." At the moment, she said to him, "Rabbi Meyer, my teacher, did you not tell me that we are required to return the deposit to its master? God has given, God has taken." Job 121. With these words, she consoled him, and his mind was eased and settled.
Thank you, Mark. A difficult story indeed. Difficult both because of the story, just just to imagine someone needing to wrestle with that kind of loss and be presented with it in that way is very difficult, but also because of the different responses here. If you think about it, and we're not going to go through each of the questions on page 158, but we'll kind of try to analyze them. Rabbi Meir and Beruria's response is very, very different. On the one hand, Rabbi Meir weeps. We're not told. If Beruria did some weeping and sadness and processing, we're not told about it. We're introduced to her as the calm, cool, and collected one. Rabbi Meir also begins to talk about what he misses about his children. He extols his children's values. He calls them my teachers, etc., etc. Whereas Beruria reframes their death by looking at the whole thing from a very, I don't know if pragmatic is the right word, or intellectual perspective, removing herself to a certain degree and seeing it for a certain truth, namely that God has given and God has taken. God has given you something for safekeeping throughout your lifetime, etc. I know there's nobody on here that took the parenting course with me, but maybe if someone's watching the recording, when we spoke at the parenting course, one of the major things we spoke about from a Jewish perspective is that Judaism does not view your children as belonging to you, but rather as an object of safekeeping, a deposit that God gives you to hold on to and to take care of during the child's lifetime and to raise them, etc., for God. So if we view it as a deposit, it says Brewery, okay, she reframed the whole story. And there really are advantages to both. You see, Rabbi Meir, obviously, we see him at least weeping. And again, we don't know. Maybe Beruria did that as well. And maybe both were done by both. But we see him weeping, and that seems to be active grieving, which seems to be good because he's processing his emotions. He also is starting to talk about the qualities of the soul versus the qualities of the body. He doesn't say, oh, my beautiful children. He says, oh, my children who were my teachers, soul qualities, which is a good place to be in terms of beginning to accept the fact that the soul is still with us, et cetera, et cetera. Bruria, the main, I would imagine the main benefit to the way she's approaching this is acceptance. She seems to have reframed it and found a way to think about it to be able to accept the reality of where they are. Now, Bruria quoted Eov, of course, Eov being Job, and that's our next story. That's text 2. Ron, can we ask you to read that one for us, please? We're on page 159, text 2.
Now the day came that Job's sons and daughters were dining and drinking wine at the home of their firstborn brother. A message came to Job and said, the cattle were plowing and the she-donkeys were grazing beside them. And Sheba fell upon them and took them, and they smote the youths by the sword, and only I alone escaped to tell you. This one was still talking, and another one came and said, a tremendous fire fell from heaven and burned the flocks and the youths and consumed them, and only I alone escaped to tell you. This one was still talking, and another one came and said, Chaldeans formed three bands, overran the camels, and took them and smote the youths with the sword, and only I alone escaped to tell you. While this one was still talking, another one came and said, your sons and daughters were dining and drinking wine at the home of their firstborn brother. And behold, a great wind came from the other side of the desert and struck the four corners of the house. It fell upon the youths who died, and only I alone escaped to tell you. Job stood up and rent his robe and tore his hair, and he fell to the ground and prostrated himself. And he said, naked I emerged from my mother's womb, and naked I will return there. God has given and God has taken. Blessed be the name of God.
Thank you. Job he's recognizing a truth. He's recognizing the truth that we all start at zero, and that really everything and anything that we have comes from God. It's a gift. If you view things that way, then if a gift is taken away from you, it's a lot less painful, right? You're owed nothing. The way naked I emerge, he says, we start with zero, right? Anything that I have on top of that, whether it's a life of one day or a life of 120 years, regardless, is a blessing, is a gift from God, and that's it. If we don't see life that way, if we see life as being more something we're owed, or my life belongs to me, etc., that's when we start to wrestle with why me? I'm outraged. How could God take it away from me, etc. If we view it as a gift, that changes the whole approach, right? Contrast that versus Bruria. Bruria is not saying it's necessarily a gift. She's saying it's a trust. But there's a certain similarity to both. They're both saying it's not owed to me. They just have different perspectives of how they can reframe it to be able to look at it as something that it being taken away from me is not as big a deal. I don't feel that it's as much of it as of an injustice. I think that probably the biggest thing that taking on, even if in a minuscule way, taking on the Job approach or the Bruria approach, taking on some form of realizing that nobody owes me anything, to the things we have in life, let's say our finances, our home, our car, our whatever, make it much more navigable. Let's go. I was going to say easy. Easy, I don't think it's ever going to be, but much more navigable when we lose those things. And the same goes for life itself. If when we own a house, we feel that we are owed that house, I earned this house, and if that house is taken away from me for one reason or another, then I will feel anger. Anger is the emotion of someone who's wrestling with something. They don't feel this is right. What was done, they feel there's an injustice. There's outrage over an injustice. That's what anger is. And if we don't feel that we owned that item by any virtue of our own, or by any it's not something that's owed to us, then I think it becomes much easier to wrestle with anger, if that makes any sense. I'm trying to think if I should do this now or not. You know what? We're not going to do it. But if you take a look at your appendix at the back of the lesson, there's a very, very interesting appendix which deals with the topic that I said we're not going to try. We're going to try and not. We're going to skirt around it, but we're not going to talk too much about it. And that is, why do good things happen to bad people? On page 175 in your book, you'll see that there's a text A and a text B, and there's kind of a question for discussion, etc. It's essentially presenting, and we're not going to go into it now, you can read it in your own time, but what it is presenting is two perspectives, one from Maimonides and one from the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, Tanya, for dealing with negative occurrences happening to someone positive. Whether that's on a singular level, like you have a friend and maybe they lost a loved one, and you're like, why would God do that to them? They've only done good for God, and they're such good people, wonderful people. They really don't deserve for this to happen, for the husband to die young, or whatever it is. Or if it's collective, such as October 7th or the Holocaust. And both of them, Maimonides and the Alter Rebbe, even though they have two different approaches, and they are different, and you can explore them to understand exactly the nuance differences in the way they take them, but both of them essentially make the same argument on a very basic level. Their argument is maybe not everything we think is good is as good as we think. Maybe not everything we think is bad is as bad as we think. Now that's the argument many people make when it comes to like, oh, long-term versus short-term, or limited perspective versus broader perspective, etc. But when it comes to God and kind of these unanswerable questions, October 7th, the Holocaust, etc., that statement that maybe something that looks bad is not as bad as we think, or maybe not just not as bad as we think, maybe it's actually a deeper good than good that we can appreciate, has to come along with a deep sense of faith, a deep sense of believing and trusting God, that God actually knows what he's doing, and that his intellect and his understanding of things might be larger and broader than my understanding of things. Again, we're not really ever going to be able to do full justice to that topic in this lesson, but I want to at least reference it. And you can see that again in your books, page 175, 76, 77, 78. Okay, having said that, let's go back to our lesson. These two perspectives that we've been addressing, Bruria and Job, underlie some of the key rituals that we do as Jews, as Yidden, whenever we experience loss. Let's take a look at some of them. Text 3a, of course, is the blessing that we make. And here they have it without God's name. The mourner themselves makes it right as soon as they place the body in the earth. Like when the casket is still, not casket, but the grave is still open, they make this blessing, and they make it with God's name. But these three words are actually the Jewish custom for any time anyone experiences loss. So whether you hear about it, so if someone from the community informs me that they lost their mother, their father, etc., as actually just happened 2 days ago, someone that I know lost their mother. Actually, not 2 days ago, it was on Thursday evening, and my response was text 3a, Baruch Dayan Hamet, blessed is the true judge. What is the connection between this blessing and death? I get it. Jews make a blessing for everything, right? We make a blessing for the czar. May God keep the czar far away from us, right? We make blessings for food, before we eat, after we eat. We make blessings for a mitzvah, for sitting in a sukkah, or for hearing a shofar, etc., etc. But why this blessing after we a person experiences loss? The reason is because it is directly wrestling with the anger issue, right? The injustice of it. It is directly offering us an alternative. Yes, you're angry, but we want you to understand that anger comes from wrestling with injustice. And if you choose to, you can have a perspective of Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, God is the true judge. And there's obviously a reason for this. This is the exact time that my loved one was supposed to live until, and God is the true judge, and he knows it. That's the connection between this blessing and why we make it immediately upon hearing about loss. The same thing is true for Kaddish. Has anybody ever paid attention to the words of Kaddish? What do the words of Kaddish mean? Elise, you want to read them for us? Text BB.
Okay.
This is not the whole Kaddish, but it's the beginning of it, and the whole thing follows the same vein.
May the great name of God be exalted and sanctified in the world that he created according to his will.
And the rest of Kaddish follows like this. God is great, God is great, he created the world. God is great, and he's great here, and he's great there, and he's great everywhere, right? Why are we all of a sudden just praising God so much, right? The answer is, meaning we do this for a full year or 11 months as we're wrestling with loss of a loved one. And the reason is the same thing. the person who just experiencing the most devastating loss, which is a person losing a loved one, we are affirming that God created and continues to create every detail of our existence, and therefore there's no injustice. Everything that happens in this world is by God's providence. There's no such thing as for no reason. At least I see you're coming in again.
I have to leave, but I'm going to do it on my phone.
No worries. Okay. I'm going to take the other one out because we're hearing. Oh, perfect. Okay. So I was going to say we're hearing some feedback. Okay. So again, both of them are trying to emphasize the same point, which is that there's nothing in this world that is unjust or that's outside the purview of it. It wasn't done by some other force other than God. It's not outside of the purview of God's strength and God's control. And therefore, if we believe that God is good, we believe that He must have some sort of reason for it. And we believe that it must be just and true and the best thing that can happen to us. Another important reason, by the way, why we say Kaddish is because we're actually trying to appreciate the perspective of the soul. And the soul, as we know from a Jewish perspective, the soul is eternal. We're about to start talking about that a little bit. And appreciating that the soul is eternal and that there isn't as much of a finality to death as we would like, not we would like, but as we usually tend to think by knee-jerk reaction when experiencing loss, is very, very helpful. And that's another reason why we say Kaddish, is to appreciate that actually the soul, when it comes to heaven, this is what the soul is saying. In other words, we say to ourselves, the soul, if it could talk, would be saying, Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei rabbah, may God's name be great, etc. Why? Because as it enters the world of truth, namely being in existence only spiritually as a soul without a body, it begins to appreciate God's greatness. And so us mimicking those words, we're kind of A, saying it on behalf of the soul, and B, reaffirming it, and reaffirming the eternity of the soul. One example of using this perspective, in other words, the eternity of the soul, to help cope with death, would be Rabbi Yosef Elbo. And Phil, if I can ask you to read this for us. This is text. Well, it's text 4b, but he's quoting text 4a. So let me just set it up for a moment, and then Phil, I'll ask you to read it for us. Rabbi Yosef Elbo is the author of the Ikrim. The Ikrim is a very, very philosophical Jewish work. It's one of the most major works. He's considered one of the greatest Jewish philosophers, Rabbi Yosef Elbo. Like any of the great quotes you've ever heard from Jewish philosophy usually come from him. And in his book, he wants to explain, he frames it as explaining the mitzvah that's in text 4a. So text 4a says, you are children of God, you shall not gash yourselves, nor shall you make any boldness between your eyes for the dead. This is a reference to two pagan customs, okay, that there were in ancient times. You ever hear the expression tearing your hair out? Right? That's what they're talking about. It was actually a custom that people had to do this, either to cut themselves or to rip hair out from their heads in order to mourn and grieve in this way. And this is a prohibited custom. It's one of the 365 prohibitions of the 613 mitzvot. 365 of them are prohibitions, and it's one of those 365 prohibitions. And that's the mitzvah. Okay. Now, Rabbi Yosef Abba wants to explain this mitzvah, but more importantly, he wants to explain the connection between the two clauses of this verse. Okay? Phil, when you're ready, go ahead.
4b, correct?
Yes, 4b.
4b. On the face of it, it would seem that the very opposite is the case, that this would be a reason to be pained and to mourn excessively over a death. Indeed, the death of a child of a king would be more cause for mourning than that of an ordinary person. Imagine that a person says to his friend, don't feel so bad about that ring you lost because it had a precious gem set in it. The meaning of the verse is as follows: because you're children of God and a holy and treasured people, it is not fitting that you mourn a death excessively, for that would indicate that you believe that the deceased is hopelessly gone, and you are therefore mourning him as you would an earthen pot that was shattered beyond repair. But it is not so in the case of death. Rather, it is like a gold or silver vessel that was broken, which can be repaired. For the soul enters into the treasure house of God. Therefore, there is no cause to be excessively pained over this, only as a person would be pained over his friends parting for him to travel to a distant place to gain much wealth by commerce. There should be no doubt that the soul, being holy, will be joined with the holy angels on high. In this way, the Torah indicates that the soul endures after death.
Thank you. So he says that's the connection between the beginning of this verse and the end of this verse, specifically because of the Jewish perspective of how we view death. That's why we're not allowed to do these things. Why? Because we want to make sure we are mourning properly, mourning appropriately, and doing these things implies doing these things is considered mourning inappropriately because it implies that death is final and that there isn't a soul that endures after death. Now, to properly appreciate Rabbi Yosef Elbow's points that he made in this text, I think it's important to unpack two fundamental Jewish beliefs that Rabbi Yosef Elbow is referencing here. Number one, of course, is the eternity of the soul. The soul, from a Jewish perspective, precedes its physical life in this world. There are midrashim and passages in the Talmud in which our sages tell us what about the soul and its experiences before it comes down into the body, and how it is then chosen to come into the body and it doesn't want to come in, etc. But then it appreciates the power of a mitzvah, so that's why it comes down into the world. Not only does it precede the body, but it also succeeds life in this world. So the 120 years or so that we live in this physical world, from a Jewish perspective, are really just the time that we can do mitzvahs. It's the time that we are here in this physical world. It's the time that the soul is enclosed in a body. But the spiritual self, the soul, actually lives on, actually is eternal, and lives on beyond life in this body. By the way, for much more on this, and I'm going to share a link in the follow-up email to this, I gave a course called The Journey of the Soul, which really spoke a lot about this, the eternity of the soul and where the soul goes afterwards. It really dealt a lot with loss and with Kaddish and why we say these things and reincarnation and where the soul goes. It's all that sort of thing. It was a great course. I know some of you took it, and it was recorded. It's on YouTube. I'm gonna send out a link to that. And if you'd like to have the book to go together with that, just reach out to me and we can arrange for that. I think I have some extra books here in the library. You can buy a book from me and then take the course with the YouTube videos. The second fundamental. So now appreciating that the soul lives on beyond the body means that when a person dies, it's not that their life ends, but rather their life now continues in an unconstrained form. Why? Because they're not constrained by materialism and by the physicality of their body. Think of people who say, for example, that the person was suffering so much physically, and they feel like now they've been released from that suffering. If we feel that life is final, and the neshama does not continue on beyond this world, then we might not say that, right? But that perspective comes from someone appreciating that actually, to a certain degree, the body is limited, is restraining. Physical life in this world is limited. And being unconstrained from that is a certain freedom. The second fundamental Jewish belief that Rabbi Yosef Abba is referencing is the resurrection of the dead, which is that one day not only will the spiritual life continue after physical life, but one day physical life itself will come back. That's a very big deal. So when Mashiach comes, from a Jewish perspective, Mashiach is the realization of our efforts throughout this world, right? Throughout the history of the world. We've done mitzvahs, and we've studied Torah, and we've refined the world, and we've brought godliness into the world, and we've been a light to the nations, and all the wonderful things. And then Mashiach comes. Mashiach is kind of the realization of all that. It's the Mashiach world, the world where godliness is revealed, etc., etc. That is such a great perspective. I'm sorry, and in that world, we are told that all those that participated in this process, namely those that did mitzvahs, etc., and were alive throughout the history of this world, will be revived and come back with resurrected. That again, both of these things together take away a lot of the finality, a lot of the feeling of broken potsherd. If this is a vessel that has been broken, it will never be able to appear back to its original form. It takes away a lot of that feeling. And as a result, should help, as it did, for example, in the cases of Beruria and Job, to help mitigate the feelings like depression or anger, which come from a perspective of death is final and life will never, ever be the same. Okay. So this is one side. I'm sorry, Ron, you had a question?
Yes. Does
Go
that
ahead.
mean that death, then you lose your ability of free will?
Absolutely, yes. And we're going to talk about that shortly. In fact, your question is a great segue into the next section, because until now, I'm sure many of you have noticed this, and this is probably what you're thinking. I've kind of, I've been pretending, I don't know if that's the right word, but we've been having a conversation as if Judaism doesn't want us to mourn at all. Like, why should you mourn? The soul lives on afterwards. There's going to be a resurrection of the dead. What's the purpose of mourning? Right? Yet we all know that there is a process to mourning from a Jewish perspective. So I'd like to try and wrestle a little bit with that, with the two sides of that coin right now. And Ron, since you brought it up, why don't you mention text 165, which is from the Rambam, Maimonides, where he codifies this as one of the 613 mitzvahs.
It is an imperative commandment of the Torah to mourn the death of close relatives.
This means that just as you're supposed to put on tefillin, just as you're supposed to put a mezuzah up on your door, just as you're supposed to listen to the shofar call on Rosh Hashanah, right? Blown on Rosh Hashanah, you also have a mitzvah to mourn for your parents, for your children to a certain degree, for your siblings to a certain degree. In other words, there's different levels. But for parents, most notably, right? And the mourning practices that are mandated by the Torah include many different things. Take a look at page 166. You'll see it in the figure. Let me pull it up. I think I have it for the screen as well. Number one is, and I mentioned this earlier, that when they make the blessing, blessed is the true judge, with God's name, we also do something called Kriya. Kriya means to tear a garment, to physically tear a garment. And this is a clear sign of mourning, right? Number two is the Shiva. Right after the funeral begins the 7-day mourning period. During that time, mourners are forbidden to work. They're forbidden to sit on high stools. They don't shower. It is a mitzvah for others to come and visit the mourner and do what the mitzvah of what's called nichum avelim, comforting the mourner, etc. After they finish getting up from Shiva and resuming everyday life, after 30 days, they're brought back into it. Shloshim is essentially, well, first of all, for those 30 days, they continue certain mourning practices, not as intensive as the 7 days, but certain ones. And at the Shloshim, we commemorate the person's life. And then throughout the rest of the year, 11 months, and then really every single year on the yard site, we do certain things such as Kaddish and good deeds. People will sponsor a Torah class. Very often people will sponsor a class here at the Academy as a dedication for their loved one, or a Kiddush or something like that, and all of it, and to study Torah, give tzedakah, right? All of it for the elevation of the soul of the person, right? So right about now, we have a simple question. And by the way, this is not all the customs. There's a ton more customs than this. I can prove the same point. But the question is, how do we answer this paradox? On the one hand, we saw that there's a lot of things that we say to reaffirm and reframe things, much like Bruria did, to appreciate that God took, God takes, and God gives. Sorry, God gives and God takes, and it's all about believing in God. And if you do, then really God is a true judge, and that no reason to be angry, no reason to be sad, no reason to be depressed. But on the other hand, the Torah tells us we're supposed to mourn. Is mourning forbidden, or is it not? I think the answer to this question will lie in appreciating an interesting law. What is that law? It's text 6. Mark, can you read it for us, please?
Number 6.
Yeah, text 6, 167.
Do not weep for the dead and do not bemoan him, Jeremiah 22:10. Meaning, do not weep for the dead more than is the measure, and do not bemoan him more than is the limit. How so? 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogy, 30 days for refraining from grooming and haircutting. Beyond this, God says, do not be more compassionate towards him than I am.
So Hashem tells us you have to mourn. You have to mourn. You mourn for 1 day, for 7 days, for 30 days, for a year, then every year again on that date, etc. You have to mourn. You have to engage in certain practices in order to. Hello. Yeah, go ahead. Sure. You have to engage in certain practices in order to mourn, in order to process this thing. However, Torah also places a very firm limit on it. If a person decides, listen, this was a very tragic loss that I experienced, for whatever reason, I feel like I really need more time to cope with it, I'm doing 14 days of Shiva. I want people to come to my house for 14 days for Shiva. Not allowed. Even 8 days is not allowed from Torah perspective. You are not allowed to add to the amount that the Torah tells you to mourn. Why? Because excessive mourning essentially starts to blur into the type of mourning that would be prohibited. You see, the Torah wants us to process. The Torah wants us to experience, let's use the word we introduced earlier in this lesson, sadness. What the Torah doesn't want is that we should get so caught up in mourning and sadness that all of a sudden now it's impossible for us to function in life and be able to move on, etc. Why? Because to a certain degree, that would be a denial of God. That would be a denial of God. Anger. The Talmud tells us that anyone who gets angry, it's as if they served idol worship. The reason for that is because when somebody becomes so angry that they stop to ascribe whatever it is that happened to them to God. I always tell people angry at God is a different story. Don't be angry at God is a different story. But before that, just being angry at someone else. For example, if I come out one day and in my driveway, I see that the windows of my car have been shattered. I come out at 6 o'clock in the morning. I'd like to go to Minyan. I'd like to go to work, whatever, And I see that the windows of my car have been shattered and the hooligans are nowhere to be seen. And my Ring doorbell camera is dead. So I don't have any evidence, nothing, whatever. And there's no way I'm ever getting anything for this. To be angry in such a situation is essentially to say, I believe that there's someone to be angry at other than God. Now, that's not to say that the flip side, which is accepting it as a sign from God, and God, obviously God wanted my windows to be smashed. That's not to say that absolves the perpetrator. No matter what the situation, a rapist, a murderer, whatever it is, obviously the person that committed the act is the perpetrator, and they have to deal out their story with God, and they will be punished from a godly perspective, etc. Leaving all that aside. However, from the victim's perspective, which often we find ourselves as the victim of some sort of loss, whether it's someone that died, whether it's some sort of financial loss, or whether it's someone even that did something to us that is terrible, we have the choice of looking at that as coming from God. And that doesn't take away from the freedom of choice of the person who did it. They were the ones who chose to do it. But if God didn't want me to lose $500, if God didn't want me to have my window smashed in, it never would have happened to me, even if that perpetrator wanted to do it. The fact that he wants to do it made him be the one to do it to me, which means that he has his own cheshbon, in the Hebrew we say, his own calculation that he has to take up with God. But from my perspective, I have to appreciate that whatever is happening to me is happening from God. So we kind of went off on a tangent here, but to bring this back here, to have anger over a loss or depression is essentially, to experience grief and mourning more than the Torah wants us to, is essentially to enter a state of anger or depression. And what's wrong with anger or depression is that it comes from a different side. It comes from a different perspective. It's not just sadness. It's not just processing. It's a whole different part of loss. For the sake of polarizing these two, let's give them names. When a person is experiencing grief, if you want to take it and divide it in half, you could divide it into two parts: outrage and unacceptance, or on the flip side, emptiness and loss. Emptiness and loss is part of grief, as is outrage and unacceptance. Except that when it comes to emotions, these look very, very different. Emptiness and loss looks like sadness. But the three things that we spoke about earlier, the three stages of grief that come from the psychologists that we introduced all the way at the beginning of the lesson, right? Denial, anger, and depression, those three stages, they're much more a reflection of outrage and unacceptance. If you are sad, you don't enter a state of denial. You don't get angry. Sadness and anger are two totally different things. Even sadness and depression are two totally separate things. Acceptance, sadness, these weeping, These are all expressions of emptiness and loss. And what the Torah is telling us is that Judaism validates we have two sides of the coin, right? If you pay attention, you will see that whenever Judaism is talking about what's allowed or what's not allowed from a breathing perspective, they're talking about two different things. You have a prohibition not to rip out your hair, not to cut yourself, etc. The reason those things are not allowed is because they're excessive grieving. They're inappropriate grieving, as Rabbi Yosef Albo said. They express much more outrage and unacceptance. However, something like Shiva or rending a garment, etc., these things much more express emptiness and loss. If we go through some of the customs that Judaism tells us to do when we experience loss, we'll start to see that. Elise mentioned that one of the first, if there's some sort of chronological order, usually denial is the first emotion, the first stage of grief that a person will go through. But it turns out denial is not something that's unavoidable. You can choose, even if you're in a state of denial, to say to yourself, I'm in a state of denial, but I need to get myself out of it, and I need to trigger a form of sadness, a form of grieving, of mourning that the Torah wants me to have. You know, as a rabbi, sometimes I get this question, you'll be surprised, but if somebody experiences loss for someone that maybe died in their 90s, maybe even over 100 years old, and didn't die a tragic death, it was like a nice, wonderful death, etc. Sometimes I get the question, Rabbi, I don't feel like sitting Shiva. There's nothing really to sit about. Like, what am I even doing here? Right? And it's my responsibility as a rabbi to remind them that to a certain degree, you're in a state of denial. No matter how peaceful and wonderful and at the right time death is, the fact is that there is a certain emptiness and loss here. No matter what, you're going to miss that person at the very least. And that has to be experienced because until you experience that, you haven't really processed it. That's why we have a process, for example, called Kriya. Kriya is rending our garments, right? Tearing our garments. And the amount of funerals that I have been to, where I arrive and the loved ones are, you know, I wouldn't say hunky-dory, you know, they're serious and they're whatever, but they're not sobbing, they're not crying, they haven't entered a state of like weeping and sadness, etc. And I don't know that every one of them can be classified by psychologists as being in a state of denial, but inevitably, when there's a physical, cathartic feeling of ripping a garment apart, and they know that the reason they're doing this is because the same way that this garment is being torn apart, their loved one is never coming back, very often that itself triggers tears. And that's not sadistic or anything. That's actually the greatest kindness that the Torah gives us. It gives us a physical way that if we're struggling and we're in a state of denial, we should be able to trigger what we need to do. We need to start a mourning process, even if we're in a situation where we're too numb and too much in denial not to be able to feel that. Shiva is similar, right? Imagine a person says, okay, that's it. I did what I needed to do. I had my funeral. I took care of it. I am going home now and I'm going to be depressed in my bed. Says the Torah, no, depression is not a good reaction. It's not a good feeling to have after loss. You need to create a space for yourself. You can combat that depression by creating a space to grieve and to heal and to begin to talk about the person and begin to often during, not often, almost always, during Shiva is the first time, for example, that mourners use the past tense about their loved ones, which is often a very difficult thing to do first, right? Imagine if they just choose to avoid it. They never have conversations about them. They're living in a certain state of denial, or worse, maybe depression, right? Or anger. Shiva is supposed to be a space, okay, you're angry, let's work our way through it, and let's say, no, I don't want to be angry. I want to begin to appreciate that there's actually a perspective to it. And without mitigating the fact that often during Shiva, there are a lot of people that maybe Shiva houses make them uncomfortable or awkward, and they say uncomfortable things to the mourners, etc. And maybe there are moments during it that it's very triggering for them. But almost always there will be things that will be shared, stories about their loved one that they didn't know, which make them feel so good about them, or perspectives on death. When Jews are coming to visit you and they know that they're here to console you and to make you feel better, they help you through that process. By the time the 7 days are over, you're ready to move on to stage 2 or whatever, stage 3 or whatever it is, the next stage. The other important aspect of the Jewish mourning process is that it is a phase process. The moment that you appreciate that this is what you're doing today, but then for the next 7 days you're doing something else, and for the next 30 days you're doing something else, etc. Right? And that even forever you're going to be dealing with it, but you're going to be dealing with it in a controlled way, because the fact is that the loss is going to be forever, right? But when a person has a way that they can come on a yard site and say Kaddish and light a candle, etc., and process that day, the Torah is giving you a framework to be able to feel those negative, those sad feelings, but only feel them in a way that is healthy and that helps you through it, and not in a way that brings you to a place of anger or depression or denial or any of these negative emotions. This is also why it's so important for all of these things to be mandated things. The way that we mourn as Jews is that we are mandated to do these things. We are told that you have to grieve. You have to go through Shiva. You have to go through Shloshim. You're supposed to come every single year and mark the day on the calendar, etc. And the reason for this is because we don't want the person to live the rest of their lives in denial. It's not considered a healthy emotion, and in an ideal world, we shouldn't be here. And right about now, I should re-emphasize what I said all the way at the beginning of the lesson. This isn't a judgment on somebody who goes through those emotions. It's natural for these types of emotions to come up. However, what we're trying to appreciate today is when these emotions do come up, which ones do I reject out of hand and say, no, this is not one that I'm supposed to feel? What are some tools that I can get to not feel that emotion? And which ones are actually I should embrace, and I should actually begin to feel them because they'll be cathartic and they'll be helpful for me. They'll be constructive and productive to moving forward. So I think hopefully what we've done over the past 10, 15 minutes is begun to have a very deep appreciation for all of these tools that the mourning process that the Torah mandated mourning process gives us to help us regain equilibrium in our lives. Another thing I want to do now, also from my introductory remarks to this lesson, is to talk about the fact that these things really apply on a more minuscule level to any sort of loss we experience in our lives. Whatever it is, if there's at some point a person feels that their feelings over this particular loss, financial, physical, relationship, right? The person loses a relationship. They really wanted to be married to this person for the rest of their lives, but after 10 years, they get divorced, right? The loss that you experience also goes through these same five phases. And even the Torah doesn't give you ways to deal with divorce. And there is a Torah way in divorce, right? But it's not the same grieving process. But that same grieving process could be applied. Yes, we should grieve for it. No, not too much. We should appreciate that it's for the better, and Hashem has something in mind for us and something in store for us. And we should thank Hashem for this step, even though it's a difficult step in our lives. The other thing, again, whether we're talking about death or whether we're talking about any other sort of loss, that we should always bear in mind is actually before we move on to that, the other thing that we should move on to that we should appreciate about death specifically, not about other forms of loss, is what the soul is up to. Not the way we see it, but the way the soul itself sees it. Mark, can I ask you to read for us, please, text 7? This is from Ethics of Our Fathers. It's on page 170, and it's a very interesting statement about this world versus the world to come, namely after death. And we're going to try to unpack it. Go ahead.
A single moment of repentance and good deeds in this world is greater than the whole of life in the world to come. And a single moment of gratification in the world to come is greater than the whole world of the life in this world.
Hold on a second. So the first half is telling us a single moment in this world is better than the world to come. But the second half says a single moment in the world to come is greater than the whole life in this world. So which one is greater, right? So it turns out it depends what you're looking at. They're both true. The soul appreciates that only in this world can a soul do a mitzvah. Only in this world can the soul actually take part in this grand vision of making the world a Mashiach place and all the wonderful things that we know of Tikkun Olam and then God's purpose of creation, etc. That can only happen as a physical soul in this world. As I think it was Ron pointed out, there's no freedom of choice in the world to come. Freedom of choice, mitzvot, only happen in this world. right? The ability to do it, because you don't get credit for doing a mitzvah if you didn't have the choice not to do the mitzvah, right? You only get credit for doing it if you actually, if that's your only choice, right? This, however, when the soul leaves the body, it begins to have something that in the English translation they're calling gratification or korot ruach. Why? Because the true effect of a mitzvah, the true spiritual energy of a mitzvah, can never really be appreciated in this world, no matter how spiritually in tune you may be. And that can only be appreciated after the soul leaves this body. So what is the soul feeling when the soul is leaving this world? Two sides of one coin. On the one hand, there's joy over its new liberated and exalted state. I get to hang out and bask in the glory of Hashem and in the spiritual glow of all of these mitzvahs that were accomplished throughout all the lives that there are in this world, including my own. But at the same time, there's a deep sense of loss. Why? Because the soul still wants to be in this world doing another mitzvah. But that loss changes. It's not a deep sense of loss like, oh my gosh, something terrible has been done to me that's unjust. No, it's the reality of life. It doesn't make it not sad. It's still sad. You know, I'm reminded of a story. There was a rabbi, one of the old Hasidim from Jerusalem. They call him the Yerushalmi Hasidim. His name was Rabbi Nachum Rabinovich. And he once came for a private audience with the Rebbe, and he observed something very, very interesting. He saw a young man, waiting. This is, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever it is, as the Rebbe is ending the day of all the different audiences that the Rebbe is having. And next to him is a young man who's waiting to go in for an audience with the Rebbe, and he seems very, very, despondent, as if he's given up on life. And he went into the Rebbe's room, and a few minutes later he came out, and he was like a changed person, alive, and happy, and upbeat, etc. And Rabbi Nachman Rabinovich was curious. So he went over to him and he asked him, he said, "Sir, tell me my hi, what happened here?" So he says, "Listen, I am a millionaire. I have everything that I need. But recently, my only son died. And all of a sudden, at that point, I felt like my life no longer had any purpose. My son was gone. I used to live for my son. There was nothing I could do to bring him back. And all the money in the world that I have is not going to help me overcome this." So he said, "I went to the Rebbe for solace, for advice, for comfort." So he says to him, "So what did the Rebbe tell you?" So the Rebbe, he says, the Rebbe asked me a simple question. He asked me what my feelings would be like if my son was not dead and had only gone on an overseas trip and was living in a foreign country. But for some reason, from that foreign country, he could not communicate with me. But I could communicate with him, and I could see, and I could tell him things, and he would hear me, but he could not communicate back. And I would know that everything is well with him and that he's safe and happy, etc. What would my feelings be like? He said, obviously, I said, I feel much better. I still feel a little sad that I'm separated from my son and I'm not together with my son. But it would be much easier for me to come to terms with. Said the Rebbe, that's actually the case. The soul transcends this physical world. It continues to live outside this physical world, and it hears and observes everything that's going on with its loved ones here in this world. And every time you do a mitzvah, every time you say Kaddish, every time you daven for that person, or you give tzedakah for that person, etc., you are sending a package. You're sending regards to, and they are receiving it. Why? Because they can appreciate the spirituality that's coming from this physical world too, in their direction. The only difference is that they cannot respond. Why? Because that's the nature of this physical world. Once a soul leaves this earth, it's now confined to the spiritual world, and it no longer interacts with the physical world. And he turned to Rabbi Rabinovich and he said, "That's why when you see me now, my perspective has changed. Am I no longer sad over the fact that I'm missing my son? Of course I miss my son. I would love to be able to hug him. I'd love to be able to be in his presence, etc. But I no longer feel angry and despondent about it. I don't feel depressed about it. I don't feel like this is like a finality. I feel like my son is in a wonderful place, and I can even continue to have a relationship with him. But there's still going to be a loss. There's going to be an emptiness from missing him physically. This is why Shlomo Melech, King Solomon, in Ecclesiastes, Philip, you can read it for us, please, and encourages us to go to the houses of mourners. Take a look at text 8, page 171.
It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, as this is the end of every man, and the living should take it to heart.
King Solomon is encouraging us to go and visit a house of mourning. Why? Because it provides perspective. The living should take to heart means that the life of the departed should be perpetuated through the lessons and the inspiration that their life provides to others. This is why we go to a house of mourning and we hear about someone else's life, and it inspires us. And it's a benefit both for the living that take the lesson from the departed, and also for the departed that are able to inspire the living. Okay, I want to conclude with one more point. Okay, and that last point is, like I started saying earlier, I just skipped a section. This last point is applicable not just to someone who's coping with the loss of a loved one, but also to any sort of major loss that we experience in our lives. The Rebbe once shared the following advice with someone. It's text 9. And after you read it, I'd like to share some words. Ron, if you can read it for us, please. It's on page 172.
The whole of creation is a descent and a downward evolution from above to below, the divine intention being that this should lead to elevation after elevation. The same applies to death and mourning, for the departed as well as for the mourners.
In other words, the Rebbe is talking about a concept that today in psychology is known as post-traumatic growth. When we say the living should take to heart, usually we mean do a mitzvah for them, etc., right? But actually, there can be even better. We can turn the loss into growth. And this is something that's been studied a lot recently in psychology, particularly with soldiers that are suffering PTSD. And whether it's losing a loved one or losing finances or losing a relationship, we can choose to take that loss and turn it into the beginning of our next stage of growth. And when we mourn properly, in other words, we process it, we don't get angry or depressed over it, we're not in denial, but we reach a healthy stage of acceptance and of reframing it as something that Hashem has done for us as opposed to done to us, then that mourning can actually help us to emerge from that, from the negative space better than we were beforehand. This is a cardinal rule in Kabbalah, in Jewish mysticism. What is that? That you know how when you take something and you want to throw it very far, what's the first thing you do? You fling back, you reach back in order to go forward, right? Like a slingshot that pulls back in order to go to be propelled much further forward. Similarly, spiritually speaking, the soul, when it comes down here, that is considered a descent. It's gone to a negative place, right? And now, when the soul leaves this world, it gets to go higher, it gets to travel higher. Why? Because it came down to this world, and that descent propels the ascent further. The same can be true for us in this world that are experiencing that loss, whether of a loved one, like we said, or even something more material. We can choose to take that descent and make no mistake, it is a descent, right? Being sad after a person passes this world is a descent. But whether that descent is for the sake of an ascent, in other words, whether that pulling back actually propels much further forward or not, that's up to us. And we can choose to make our experience of loss a case of post-traumatic growth. To share some of the psychology on this topic, I'd like you to turn your attention to the video screens. And this is again on the topic of PTSD in soldiers. And you'll see how many soldiers actually take it and they view the traumatic experience as something more beneficial for them and something that actually helps them grow.
After the the loss of a loved one might think that the best case scenario for recovery is that the person resumes the life they had before in a way that is as close to normal as possible. However, Richard Tedeschi, a psychologist at the University of North Carolina, has identified an amazing phenomenon whereby a traumatic event impels a person to a better place, better intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. He named this phenomenon post-traumatic growth and encountered it when interviewing people who had survived severe injuries and older people who had lost their spouses. Many people told him the same thing. They wished deeply that they had not lost a spouse or been paralyzed, but nonetheless, the experience changed them for the better. A recent New York Times article chronicled this phenomenon in the context of soldiers in war. In 2005, while deployed in Iraq, Sergeant Jeffrey Beltran's Humvee was hit by a bomb. The blast broke Beltran's knee and leg, fractured his lower spine, and buried shrapnel in his thigh. He underwent 14 operations over the next year and experienced anger, mood swings, physical and psychological pain. In 2007, Beltran served in Afghanistan, where he witnessed the many traumas of war, including the death of a close friend. After 6 months in Afghanistan, Beltran was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Over time, though, Beltran began noticing surprising changes. Before the bomb blast, he was a drifter and spent much of his free time playing video games. He was more concerned with figuring out how to cope from one deployment to the next than with finding direction. He is different now. The bombing, the post-traumatic stress, and the challenges he faced changed him. But he feels he has changed for the better. Beltran says, "This whole experience has helped me to be more open, more flexible. I am branching out to activities that I was once uncomfortable with." Beltran is actively pursuing a promotion. He's taking online courses toward a bachelor's degree in criminal justice. And he's also discovered a sense of spirituality. According to Tedeschi, only a seismic event, not just an upsetting experience, can lead to this kind of growth. People show positive changes in 5 areas of life. They experience more personal strength, have a renewed appreciation for life. Their relationships improve. They discover new goals and possibilities, and they feel spiritually more connected. Post-traumatic change does not usually occur in one transcendent moment, but over years of searching. That was the case for Sergeant Beltran. He comments, "Instead of labeling myself as a post-traumatic stress disorder veteran, I say that I am a post-traumatic growth veteran. I am a person looking forward."
The reason I think this is such a powerful point is because I think it's very, very easily applicable to everyone, even those that are not suffering some sort of crazy loss or trauma, etc. The exercise of the week is going to be for those that are experiencing that. And let me start off by sharing that. For this week, I think it would be nice if you know someone who experienced loss recently, if you can connect with them, convey words of consolation, and help them, process through what they're processing, and get them to the next step, finally to get to acceptance, to get to a space where they can actually grow from it. But I want to suggest actually something else for the exercise of the week. In addition to that, that's the official exercise of the week. It's on page 174. But I want to suggest another exercise. You can write it down on page 174 as another option. Maybe this week you can try to find something that you've experienced that was negative in the past, let's say, 6 months, right? Leaving October 7th and Israel out of this. I mean, personal. You broke a limb. You got very sick. A certain opportunity was presented to you and then taken away from you, whatever it is, right? Something that happened to you where you experience loss. It's not something where you can do something now to go deal with it. It's just you have to grieve over it, right? And how can you reframe that, Eov style, Job style, Bruria style, into some way that actually maybe God has something better for me in store? That actually that I'm not going to live with the trauma of this causing me stress, but the trauma of this is actually going to cause me growth. I'm not ignoring the trauma. I'm not ignoring the fact that something happened to me that was pretty bad and I need to get over it. But maybe there's a way to look at that as a way of helping me grow and moving forward. So that's the second exercise that I'd like to leave you with for this week. In addition, obviously, to the first one, which is to find someone that you know that's currently experiencing loss and help them with that. Please turn your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson. Hold on a second. I see that for some reason the audio is not coming through. I think it's, oh yeah, here we go. No.
Key points, lesson 5. 1. The death of a loved one is a devastating experience, with the potential to irreparably destroy the joy of life. The teachings of Judaism and the mourning observances mandated by Torah law provide a framework and a process that enable us to cope with traumatic loss, eventually regain our emotional equilibrium, and ultimately grow from the experience. 2. A large part of what people commonly experience as grief is attributable to the non-acceptance of death. A second aspect of grief is the pain of loss. Jewish teaching counteracts the non-acceptance aspect, even as it validates and engages the loss aspect. 3. Every moment of life is a gift from God and a sacred trust from the divine giver. The Jewish response to death is acceptance that the soul entrusted to us has been retrieved by its owner, and gratitude for what was given and entrusted. 4. A series of Torah-ordained mourning practices stave off the common grief responses of denial, anger, and depression, while impelling the mourners toward healing and consolation for the pain of the loss. 5. Belief in the eternity of the soul and the future resurrection, combined with the knowledge that our relationship with a departed loved one lives on through our positive actions, mitigates the pain of parting imposed by death. 6. The mourning process is not just for the benefit of the mourner, but also for the benefit of the departed soul. Hence, mourning is mandatory, even while excessive mourning, which indicates non-acceptance, is proscribed. 7. A cardinal law of existence is that every regression is a descent for the sake of ascent, hence the phenomenon of post-traumatic growth, where the trauma of loss impels a person to a higher and better place than before.
Thank you all for joining us for lesson 5. This has been lesson 5 of How Happiness Thinks When Joy Seems Elusive. And we look forward to next week when we will be doing lesson 6 and our final lesson, The Joy of the Spirit. And we will be exploring the deeper dimensions of happiness and concluding this whole conversation. Thank you all for joining us.